Welcome to our guided virtual dissection of the nervous system. We're going to be exploring the major structures and their functions of the nervous system. Primarily, we're going to put our attention on the brain. When we're all done, we will have a diagram or a virtual brain that looks a lot like this, color coordinated and labeled, and you'll also see that I've dissected away the external part of the brain so that way we can look inside of the brain as well. Once you have logged into your biodigital account, it is a free account, you want to go to Explore tab, select the Anatomy by Systems, and from here you want to scroll down until you find the nervous system. It'll be organized as female and male nervous system. You can select either one, it doesn't matter. I'm going to select the female nervous system. Can be a little bit tricky. If you're using a mouse, the wheel will zoom in and zoom out for us. If all you have is a touchpad, using 2 fingers on the touchpad, pushing away from you will zoom away or zoom out, and zoom in, with the 2 fingers you drag it towards you. Now to turn, if you're using a mouse, you want to use the left click. Okay, and that'll turn it for you. If you are using a touchpad, you would click down on the touchpad and just turn left, right, up and down, and so on. Okay. Now see if you can manipulate it so you have it oriented so the anatomical model is facing left, your left. Now on the left, you will notice this toolbar here, or a menu bar. We have chapters. This is where we would actually be saving some of our work, but our focus is going to be on the anatomy. So if you click on anatomy, you'll see we've got 2 different selection or menu bars. The integumentary is basically just showing you that we have an outline, so you can either leave it on or you can hide it. I think it looks a little weird that way, so I'm going to leave it on. And we also have the nervous system, so if you click that, it'll open it up and you can see the 2 divisions of the nervous system. Our focus will be the central nervous system, so I'm going to click on that. We've got our brain and our spinal cord. I'm going to click on the brain, and we see that we have these 4 divisions or components to the brain that we're going to explore: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Okay, up above we have these toolbars. Okay, select, just like it sounds, it's going to allow us to select a structure. So if I click, it will highlight this portion of the brain, one of the portions of the frontal lobe. And you'll notice over here on the left in our menu, it will also tell us what that name is. Another important tool that we're going to be using is the label feature. So if I clicked on label, click on my structure, and it will label it for me. Now click it so it's highlighted or bolded. I can come over here and then I can relabel it. Okay. And down below, if I want to talk about the function, which I would do later, we can add that later. We can also paint our structure. So if we click on the paint tool, you'll see we have different colors to choose from. We have these presets. We also have custom. We're probably going to use custom a whole bunch, especially after we've used up all of our presets. If there's something that you did that you don't like, we can always hit undo over here. If you want to remove the entire label, you click on it, highlight it, and you can just simply hit delete. And then if you click off to the side, you can deselect what you already selected. Okay, let's begin exploring and dissecting our virtual brain. I'm going to turn the brain around. We're going to look on the posterior side. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, and we notice that we have, this is our cerebrum, and this is our cerebellum. We're going to start with the cerebellum. I'm going to select it. Now I want to paint it. So I'm going to choose a custom color, and I'm going to slide that to somewhere in the green area, and I can also drag this. I want to make this dark green. There we go. We got a dark green. We want to add a label. Okay, I'm going to drag the label, get it out of my way. I want to highlight that label, and I am going to add a description. So the cerebellum is also known as the little brain. It is going to be responsible for processing information from the frontal lobe, which will begin any of our motor tasks such as walking. It's also going to coordinate some of the actions based on sensory and spatial information. So it's going to allow us to kind of get a sense of our world around us, like maybe it's rocky ground, for instance, or it's not quite level. And so it's going to take in that information as well. And it's basically just going to ensure that while we're walking, while we're doing things, we are balanced and stable along the way so we don't fall. Now I want to look at my cerebrum. So I just want to hit that select button. I'm I'm gonna just click on that. So the cerebrum is the most superficial part of the brain. It's going to make up most of the brain's mass, and it's organized into these two distinct hemispheres. We have our left and our right hemisphere, and it's divided or separated by this very deep groove. And you can see that there. You can actually kind of see all the way past that. That's called the longitudinal fissure. Our cerebrum is responsible for many of our higher functions, such as learning, memory, planning, consciousness, all those things, emotions. Another feature of our cerebrum is these ridges here. These are known as gyrus. We're going to label a gyrus. All right, so you'll see here that it's giving me the actual name of that gyrus, but let's just simplify that. We're just going to call it a gyrus. I'm going to change that label. And so what the function of a gyrus is, all these folds, is it's going to increase the surface area to allow maximum amount of learning and memory and so on. And that's something that's quite unique with humans, is we have a tremendous amount of folds, and that gives us our capacity for learning and so on. And then all of these grooves, these are known as sulcus. Let's see if I can get a label right in there. And again, it's obviously labeling the gyrus here, or the lobe. So I'm going to click on that and we're going to call it a sulcus. So a sulcus is really just a shallow groove in between the gyrus folds. Now you'll notice that if I move my structure, those labels are going to kind of hover. So I want this to be a little bit more tucked in so they don't move and it doesn't get in our way. So I'm just going to kind of do this. Okay. All right. And hopefully that won't move so much. Well, anyway, we'll leave it like that for now. Now I want to hit paint because we're going to look at the cerebrum a bit more. So the first component of the cerebrum is known as the cerebral cortex. So that's the outermost part. Once we start dissecting, we're going to see some other components to the cerebrum. So for now, we're going to look at the cortex. So cortex just means the outer layer, and it's divided into 4 lobes, very similar to the 4 parts of our skull. We have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe or temporal lobe, and then we have our occipital lobe. All right, so we're going to color coordinate this. All right, so let's select our red, and then we're going to go over to our frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is all of this here, okay? And I only want to do one side. We're only going to color coordinate the left hemisphere. So all of this is the frontal lobe, okay? You want to be careful, okay, not to select this. So this is also part of the frontal lobe here. Our parietal lobe is this back here. So the parietal lobe, we're going to make a dark blue. And again, we're only going to worry about the left hemisphere. We'll color coordinate that because we're going to get rid of all the other stuff on the other side to dissect in. Our temporal lobe, we're going to make a light purple. So I'm going to come on over and I'm going to custom select and choose that. Kind of slide this over till it's I don't know, that looks like a pretty good purple, but I want to make it a little bit lighter. Okay, so something like that, sort of like a lavender. Okay, all right, and I'm just gonna, oh, that came out a little bit too pink. Okay, that should work. Ah, that's good. All right, so that is our temporal lobe, and then our occipital lobe, I'm gonna make that the cyan color. Okay, so there we go. We have our 4 lobes. Now I want to add some labels to this. So our frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is involved in learning, behavior, all of these higher order thinking, executive functions such as planning. It's going to also help control all of our motor functions. So our muscle movement, our ability to speak, our eye movement. So I'm going to talk about that here. Now I want to label my parietal lobe. Again, we'll have to change that name. And then we also want to describe the parietal lobe. And so our parietal lobe, this is going to be the component of the brain that's going to receive all of the information from our surroundings, such as touch from the skin and from our muscles. And it's going to interpret that. It's going to help to evaluate weight, just how heavy something is, and pressure maybe applying to our skin. It's going to be able to detect the type of texture maybe that we feel. So without looking, we're going to be able to understand our world just from touch. So if we're touching a feather versus a brick, for instance, it's going to let us know, and it's going to interpret that for us. Now the frontal and the parietal lobe are divided by a sulcus, or that groove. This is known as the central sulcus. So I'm going to add a label right there. I'll try to make it right in between. Okay. Again, we'll have to change that, and we're going to make that the central sulcus. Now on to our temporal lobe. Now, the temporal lobe, conveniently placed on the side of our head, this is what is going to be taking in any kind of sound or auditory information from our ears, and it is going to interpret that auditory information, that auditory input, basically help us with recognizing, so we can determine whether it's grandma or a bird chirping or the sound of scraping. It's also going to be involved in understanding language. So we would be able to recognize words as being English or a different language, and then obviously understand what those words mean. The last thing that the temporal lobe is involved in is short-term memory storage. So this is where, as information is coming in, we're going to store it in the temporal lobe temporarily, and then eventually, once we practice that information or that information becomes more meaningful, then we will start to form longer term memory and we'll store in other locations within our brain. Now, the sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobe, this is known as our lateral sulcus. So we're going to change the name of that. Now let's turn to our occipital lobe. We're going to label that. I'm going to make sure that I label the left-hand side because I'm going to be removing all of this right side. So we've got our left occipital lobe. You can leave that left if you prefer. That's fine. Now our occipital lobe, this is going to be responsible for receiving and interpreting all of the visual information from our eyes. So it's going to be involved in image recognition and perception. Now, separating our left from our right hemisphere is a fissure. This is a deep groove, and we can see this. We talked about that a little bit earlier. This is going to be a little difficult because you can't really label a space. I'm going to place it, let me see, I'll try to put it right about here. It's going to be confusing because it's labeling it as the lobe, but I just want to make sure that we know that that is going to be where our longitudinal fissure is. Now that we have our cerebral cortex labeled, we're going to start our dissection so we can look at some of the deeper portions of our brain. So I want to make sure that I click on my select tool. Now, sometimes this gets a little crazy and it will actually automatically go to label, so just be mindful of that. So we want to turn, so we're going to turn our model so it is facing to our right, and we want to start removing the cerebral cortex on the right hemisphere. So I'm going to hit hide. Okay, and we're just going to see how that popped up. All right, so just if that happens, just go off to the side. It will remove it. Okay, and
we're going to remove our cerebral cortex.
Okay, so what you see here is this white matter. So white matter, different from the gray matter that we saw. White matter is just more fatty tissue that is going to help move that information between the cerebral cortex and some of the deeper centers of our brain. We're also going to remove this as well. There are a few other structures that we're going to remove. They're important, but we're going to overlook them for now. Okay, that looks like we've got everything. Okay, so we're just going to do a quick little check. So this will help determine if you removed all the right things. Okay, so I've got my select feature. So, okay, of course. There we go. Okay, so this should read our cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus. Okay, this is going to actually be part of our limbic system. Let's label that. Now the limbic system here, this is where the cortical is going to meet the subcortical. We're going to talk about the subcortical in just a moment. Basically, it's our emotion center, so it's involved in motivation, learning, as well as memory. Now I'm going to turn our model so we can see the anterior, the front of it, and you're going to notice this extra little piece here. This is all of this section here. This is known as the subbrain. We also have a deeper part we'll look later, but this is known as a subbrain. We're not going to discuss all of this. We're going to remove this piece here. It's called the right putnam. So this is the putnam. We're going to remove that. Now, if you clicked on it, it did not say putnam, you might not want to remove it. We also want to remove this portion here. This is our internal capsule. So we're going to get rid of that as well. Okay. We're also going to get rid of the globus or globus. And we just want to make sure we've got everything here. Okay, we also want to remove the caudate nucleus. Okay, and so what we want to get down to is what's known as the thalamus. We should have this piece here. This is called the amygdala, the parahippocampal gyrus. We can get rid of that. Looks like we've gotten rid of most of what is in our way. Take a look at this structure here. It looks like this translucent. This is known as a cerebral aqueduct or a ventricle. This is going to contain the cerebrospinal fluid. I'm going to click on that so you can see it. That, all right, so that's our ventricle. A cerebrospinal fluid, what that is it provides water, nutrients, as well as cushion for our brain. Now, it's going to be in the way of some of those subcortical structures that I want to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it. Okay. And then we're going to look at some of the other components here. So the first one here, you see this sort of like a darker pink or red. I'm going to click on that. This is our choroid plexus. So we just talked about the ventricle or the cerebral aqueduct. And this is going to provide, so the choroid plexus is going to produce that cerebral spinal fluid for us. So let's paint that. We're going to paint that a very dark red. And we will label it choroid plexus. Okay, and I just want to describe it. So this is going to produce our cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, I'm going to remove this structure as well. There are some deeper structures I want to take a look at. Okay. And actually underneath that, you could see our other ventricle. So this would be the left side of that ventricle or that aqueduct. Okay. Actually, we can now label that. Okay, so looking at the subcortical regions, so I'm going to turn this anteriorly. Okay. We have this bulbous structure here. I talked about that a little earlier. This is called the amygdala. Right here. Nope. Okay. We have the amygdala. I'm going to bring that down here. And we also have underneath that what's known as our hippocampus. Okay, so I'm going to put these two together. They actually kind of work together. They coordinate with each other, although all of the brain works together. These guys have very similar functions. So our hippocampus is responsible for retrieving any memories that we formed and then stored within our cortex. And then the amygdala, working alongside with the hippocampus, it's going to be involved in that long-term memory formation as well as all of our emotional responses. A little interesting fact, one of the things that we notice when a patient is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, this is one of the first areas of the brain to start to break down. It makes sense when someone has degenerative disorder or deterioration of the brain, the individual will lose their ability to retrieve short-term memory. So you can be telling them a story and they will completely forget it, or they'll tell you a story over and over and over again. That's what the function of the hippocampus and the amygdala have, is basically working with that retrieval and storage of information, of memories. Now that we've looked at the cortical and the subcortical regions, let's take a look at the centralmost part, which is our diencephalon. So the diencephalon literally means a throughway. So all of the information that the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum must communicate and store needs to go through the diencephalon first. So even if the cerebrum wants to talk to another part of the cerebrum, it needs to go through the diencephalon. So let's take a look. We have this structure known as the thalamus, this sort of bulbous structure. Okay, the thalamus is responsible for taking that sensory information and sending it to the appropriate location in the brain. So for instance, if it is sound, it's going to move from our ears, it's going to pass through the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to decide where it needs to go. It's also going to decide if it needs to do anything about it. Like, hey, is that just some interesting noise I've never heard before and I want to know more about it and I'm going to turn my head and look over? Or is it just something I'm very familiar with and I can kind of tune it out? So it's going to make those decisions. Okay, I have my thalamus labeled. Now I want to color it in. I'm going to color it in that cyan color. Okay, and now we'll move anterior and inferior to that. Okay, this is our hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is essentially the control center for maintaining all of the homeostasis in our body by regulating the endocrine system. Basically, all of the hormones in our body is going to be regulated for the most part by our hypothalamus. It's going to do so by controlling the pituitary gland, which we'll talk about in a moment. So it's also going to be involved with the limbic system, be involved in that memory and emotions. So now we'll label that. I'm going to paint the hypothalamus a lime green. The next structure is the pituitary gland. Okay, I'm going to zoom right in. Okay, I'm going to turn more anteriorly. And so it's kind of hanging right here underneath the hypothalamus. It actually has these two lobes here. So I'm going to label, see if I can, oh, no, that's what I was afraid of. There we go. Okay, so our pituitary gland. Okay, so you can see that it has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So I'm going to change that label and just call it the pituitary gland. It actually is part of two systems. It's primarily going to function with the endocrine system in that it's going to help to maintain homeostasis by regulating all of the hormone levels in the body. So basically it's going to manage our metabolism, our body temperature, water balance, heart rate, sleep, hunger, thirst, all of those super essential body functions. It's also going to be involved in growth as well. Okay, now we're going to paint our pituitary gland a pink. So we're going to, we'll just go with this hot pink here. Both lobes. Our pituitary gland is labeled. We're going to take a look at our brain stem. So we're just about done here. So before I back away, it makes sense to stay here because we've got a lot of structures. Our diencephalon and our subcortical area really do sort of surround the top portion of the brainstem. So the brainstem is going to connect our brain down to our spinal cord. So this first structure here, this actually we're going to remove. So we're going to hide it. This is known as the peduncle. So we want to hide that. Okay, and that's going to reveal our midbrain, which is part of our brainstem. So I'm going to paint our midbrain a green, but I don't want it to be the same green as the hypothalamus. So I'm going to select more of a, let's say more of a limey green, I guess. You can go more blue, I suppose. Yeah, okay, we'll try that one. And it looks about the same. We'll leave it. But we will label it. So this is our midbrain. Okay, and so the midbrain is responsible for relaying any kind of auditory or visual or what's known as somatosensory. So any sensation from our body we receive, such as touch, it's going to send all of that information up to the cerebrum for processing. It's also going to be responsible for combining some of that auditory, visual, and somatosensory information and kind of map it for us. So for example, let's say that I hear a bird tweeting. I'm going to basically be able to tell what direction that tweeting is coming from. And from there, it's going to coordinate or control my eye movement in that direction. Likewise, so we could also say sort of like that hand-eye coordination as well. So it's really just communicating all of our senses and creating more of like a spatial field for us. So let's label that. Okay, now just below the midbrain is what's known as the pons, P-O-N-S. Okay, so it's our pons. So our pons is responsible for connecting the cerebellum. So that's that dark green structure here in the back. So it's going to connect the cerebellum to the brainstem as well as the forebrain or the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. We talked a little bit about this earlier when we discussed the cerebrum. So I had said that the cerebrum is going to help us with balancing. So as we're initiating those steps, we're also going to take some information from the world around us and decide just how we're going to take those steps and maintain that balance so we don't fall over, especially when the earth is maybe not necessarily flat. We're walking on shaky grounds or rocky grounds. So the pons is going to be responsible for relaying that information specifically between the frontal, which is responsible for movement, and the cerebrum for coordinating that balance. So we're going to color our pons a very, very light pink. And then the last part of our brainstem here is the medulla oblongata. Let's label that. And so we're going to color this one in like a sagey color, I guess. Now, the medulla oblongata is going to be involved in just sort of general brain activity and attention related to sleep. So basically, you know, when it's time to get some rest, our medulla is going to sort of coordinate that, say, okay, brain, shut down. It's time to get some rest. Or, and vice versa, all right, this is really important. You need to pay attention, right? So that's what our medulla is responsible for. Okay, while we're here really close, I'm actually going to move this out of the way. This structure here looks like a snail shell. This is actually part of our auditory. So this is the bones, or rather the nervous tissue within the bones of our middle ear. So this is where sound is collected and then it's transmitted into our temporal lobe. Just some interesting things. All of this yellow that we see, these are all of the nervous tissue. And I don't know if you can notice here, you have these sort of like little bulbous, these are sort of more ganglion or ganglia, okay? So these are all the nerves that are moving from our body to our brain. Some other really cool things here we can take a look at. So if I zoom in, so now we're looking at some of the, let me move some of this down. There we go. Okay. So up front, see all this, these two bulbs, this is our olfactory, so our smelling center. So this would sit at the top of your nose, and then all of these portions hanging down, these would be all of the nerve fibers responsible for receiving all of the different smells entering your nose. And if I continue to turn, and we get a little closer to the back of the eye, this structure here is the optic nerve right here. So this is going to send information from the back of our eye. So all of the images will get collected within the eye, and then it'll get sent down the optic nerve and then all the way to the back of our brain to our occipital lobe here. Okay. So there are a lot of different nerves here. I'm not going to go over all of them. I just wanted to kind of share some of these interesting ones with you here. Now, let's take a look at our spinal cord. So all of these nerves, except for the ones that are close to the skull and associated with our face, all of these nerves are going to exit and enter via the spinal cord. So our spinal cord is actually composed of two different sides. We have our anterior and our posterior, what's called horns. If I zoom in here just a little bit more, you can see how you have nerves coming in or attached to the posterior side, and then nerve bundles attached to the anterior side. The posterior horn, these are going to receive sensory input from the body. These are all of the sensory nerves. So all of your sensation is going to enter from the to the back of your spinal cord, and then that information will then travel all the way to your brain, where it'll get processed, as we talked about earlier. Our brain will decide whether or not we're going to respond to that information. And if we are, it's going to come all the way back down and then exit the pathway to get to whatever organ is going to respond. So our motor nerves, okay, are the responding nerves, and they're going to exit via the front. And then the sensory nerves will enter on the posterior side. So sensory nerve and motor nerve. Let's just take one of them and we can label those. Okay. So I'll take that. Okay. So this is on the posterior side. So this would be our sensory nerve. And then on the anterior side, we would have our motor nerve. All right, let's now neaten this up. I like to kind of coordinate it a tiny bit because this is kind of some craziness here. I'm just going to kind of bring some of these nerves down a little bit so that way it's a little neater. I'll bring that down. We've got our ventricles, corpus callosum. We can stick that down there as well, and so on. And you can neaten this up, make it make sense for you a little bit more so these lines don't get so crossed. Before you exit out of here, you want to make sure that you save your work. So that way, when we revisit this, I'm going to teach you a little bit more about some of those functional areas of the brain, but you've got all of this already labeled for you, so go ahead and save it. And that concludes our tutorial on a virtual dissection.